Welcome to this lesson on the principles of training. This lesson we're going to look at several different principles that underline the way that we design or plan a fitness training program. We're not going to go into massive detail on each. Think of this as a bit of an introductory session. Let's take a look. So the first principle is the principle of specificity. And the specificity principle states that training should be specific, not general or random. Not general or random. Don't just make it up on the spot. Don't just turn up at the gym or turn up at the track or wherever and just make something up and give it a go and see what happens. That's not specific enough. What you should really be doing, according to the specificity principle, is you should be making sure that your training is targeting adaptations that are beneficial for your sport or for your other goals. So you need to begin with the thing that you want to achieve and almost reverse engineer the steps that will take you there. So your training should target the specific adaptations that will be beneficial for your sport. If your sport is an endurance event, you need to be training to target endurance related adaptations. So adaptations to do with the cardiovascular system, adaptations to do with the respiratory system. But if your sport is a sprint or power event, then your training is going to look very different. So the idea of specificity is that you need to be specific about targeting those adaptations that are beneficial for your sport. So that does mean seeking relevant or useful adaptations in all systems, where they're relevant, of course, as it says here. It may be that you're going to focus on the cardiorespiratory system, but you'll probably need to do, let's say you're a triathlete or some kind of endurance athlete. Yes, the majority of your training will be focusing on the cardiovascular and the respiratory systems in terms of adaptations for endurance, but you'll probably do some muscular stuff as well. So you're going to need to balance those things out. So in terms of being specific about your training, you need to be targeting the adaptations in the right proportions as well that will help you achieve your particular fitness or sport related fitness goals. That's also true, as it says here, in terms of movement patterns and other technical aspects. So if your sport includes a lot of technical movements, and as most sports do have a certain degree of technicality about them, you should also be specific about including those in your training as well. So the principle of specificity means that you need to be specifically targeting the adaptations in body systems and in movement patterns and so on, specifically targeting those adaptations that are relevant for your sport or for the thing that you're trying to achieve. There's no point just going in the gym and just making it up and doing things at random. You won't see the gains or the goals or the achievements or the adaptations that are actually beneficial for you in your sport. Secondly, then, the next principle is the overload principle. The overload principle. And simply this principle states that a level of training stress, overload is a level of training stress that is greater than you're accustomed to. Overload, as the term suggests, is just overloading, just going a little bit beyond what you're comfortable or accustomed to. So you're not just in a kind of a rut in terms of your training, but you're pushing yourself beyond, just beyond, not way beyond, but just beyond the limits of your present capacity. Because again, like we've just talked about with specificity, you're trying to create adaptations in the body systems or in the movement patterns. So you need to, in order to do that, you need to challenge your body just that little bit more, just provide just a little bit more training stress than what you've been accustomed to. And there's various different ways to achieve this level of overload, because training stress can be increased essentially by manipulating two things. Training stress can be increased by manipulating the duration and intensity of the training. So those two things together, you can play those off against one another, but by affecting the duration, so that's how long or how many sets and reps or whatever, and the intensity, so how hard you're working, those two things, the time and the intensity, I guess, are the two things that are most significant in terms of making sure that the training stress you're placing yourself under is an appropriate level of overload, but also, as we've just thought, is specific to your sport. So how could we actually do this? What does that look like in practice? So we could alter the work-rest intervals. So we're playing with duration and intensity here. The work and rest intervals, you might go from, if you're doing some kind of circuit training, for example, you might go from doing 30 seconds of work with a minute rest to doing 40 seconds of work with 40 seconds rest, for example. So that's just one example. There's a million and one different ways of doing it, but by altering the work-rest intervals, you can overload the body systems. And you might want to just increase that week on week, or session upon session, or period upon period of time. So it might be a set of weeks you might work at one work rest, a set of work rest intervals, and then in 3 weeks' time you'll change it to make it slightly harder. So you can alter the work rest intervals. You can also, obviously, add weight. So you can increase what we would properly call the load. Increase the load, hence the term overload. So you can increase the load. So lifting, in this example, lifting heavier weights would count as overload. You can also overload by increasing the number of sets you do and the number of repetitions you do in those sets. So you can increase the load by adding weight, you can increase sets, you can increase reps, you can do all of those, you can do some of those, you can mix those up, but all of those are different ways that you can overload the body systems. And so you're probably thinking already, well, there's absolutely loads of things that I can do. There's so much stuff that I can do to tweak and adapt and increase the level of training stress to provoke this overload in my training. And you'd be right, there is absolutely stacks of stuff that you could do. You could also increase the speed at which you're working, the speed of movement, the speed of running or swimming or whatever it is. You could aim for training at a higher speed, and obviously those two things are manipulated, or speed is manipulated by these two things, distance and time. So you could change the distance over which you're training, and that's relevant for whether you're doing sprinting or whether you're doing long distance work. You could change the distance and change the speed at which you move through that distance, or change the amount of time that you spend in each activity. All these things, work rest intervals, weight and load, and sets and reps and speed and distance and time, all of these things can be adapted or manipulated. And what you're trying to do is manipulate them to make the activity that you're doing, which you've already determined as being specific for your sport, you want to make it ever so slightly overloading. So just beyond your present level of capability. You don't want to massively overload, so go way beyond. You wouldn't, for example, make a big jump in distance. So you wouldn't, if you're doing, let's say you're learning, you're doing a couch to 5K or something like that, and you're trying to increase the distance that you can jog. You won't literally start on day one going from a one gentle jog round the block then to a full 5K. That's not sensible levels of overload. We need to be sensible about the amount of overload. And so the next concept then takes on board this idea of overload, but manipulates it slightly, just adapts it slightly. The next concept is the concept then of progressive overload. Progressive overload. So we've talked about specificity and overload. And what we want to do is we want to overload our bodies in a way that is progressive. So that is, we're moving in a particular direction without taking huge jumps. We want to overload our bodies to the level at which they're just being pushed a little bit harder each time. We don't want this massive jump because we're going to injure ourselves, but we do want to be progressing in a particular direction. And what happens with this, as your body adapts to the overload, then the extent of overload further down the line has to be more. So, for example, if you're deadlifting a relatively low weight, let's say you're deadlifting 50 kilograms, okay, your overload might be, let's try 55, or let's try 57.5, something like that. But once you become comfortable with that, once you can lift that with good form and so on, Then you might want to push to 60 and 62.5 and 65 and so on. You want your overload rather than going from 50 straight up to 70, you want to go through that progression to make sure that the adaptations are actually happening at a sensible and maintainable pace where you're not putting yourself at risk, you're not going to damage yourself. So as adaptations occur, the training stress required to achieve overload will also change. So as you become stronger, for example, with this deadlift example, you're going to need to have a greater level of training stress in order to achieve overload. Because now 65 kilograms is fairly straightforward for you. So you're going to need to push up to 70. So the training stress, the overload, needs to be slightly higher. The load needs to be higher in order to hit that sort of target of overload. And as your body adapts, that overload is going to move further and further, lifting more and more, running further and further, running faster, whatever it might be, depending on what your training has been specifically for. So the idea of progressive overload is that this overload that we've talked about should be built in. This progression should be built into a training program. So when you're planning, you should plan in advance how long you think, I mean, you can adapt it as you go along, that's fine, but you should plan in advance how long you think it's going to take for the adaptations you're looking for, the specific adaptations you're looking for, to be achieved. And you should plan for the overload to move on. So you wouldn't set a series of overload goals in session 1 and have them as the same extent of overload in session 25. You would want to move towards increasing adaptations. So this progression should be built into your training program. So week 1 and week 2 will look different to week 23, 24, 25. You'll be in those later weeks, you'll be lifting heavier, or you'll be running further, or you'll be sprinting faster, or whatever. But you need to make sure it's progressively overloaded from day 1 to wherever your program ends up. So the idea, of course, is that it must be gradual and systematic. So you've got to think about it in advance. Don't just make it up and make it stepped. Don't have big jumps in overload. So we need to maintain appropriate levels of overload whilst accounting for the ongoing adaptations. So you should be expecting, as you train, you should be expecting those adaptations to occur, and you should have planned in what happens next. So what do we move on to next? But it must be gradual and systematic. Why should it be gradual and systematic? Because it's very important to avoid overtraining. We'll come back to overtraining in just a minute. The next concept then is a concept of, well, the next principle is the principle of reversibility. And this essentially means that just as if we progressively overload, we will increase our fitness levels in whatever component of fitness we're trying to target. The same is true if we stop training. The inverse is true if we stop training, because any adaptations that we do gain from training can be lost if training ceases. So what's called training cessation. So we stop training completely. So that might be because of injury, it might be because of boredom, who knows why. Okay, but if training ceases, those adaptations that we recently gained can be lost, and in fact they can be lost quite quickly. So if we cease training, we lose adaptations, but also we can continue to train, and if we don't get to the levels of overload that are required for continued adaptation, actually the reverse can happen. It's a strange idea, but you can be training regularly, but if there is an adequate level of overload, actually you can be losing fitness in whatever component it is that you've stopped working on, or that you've stopped provoking beyond your current level. So if you fall below if your training falls below adequate levels of overload, actually you can start to lose the adaptations instead, because the body will always adapt to be able to do whatever it is you consistently ask it to do. So if you consistently ask your body to work at a level that's slightly overloaded, the body will adapt to that. But if you consistently ask your body to work to a level that's slightly underloaded, so it's relatively comfortable for you, your body will adapt to that as well, which means that therefore those adaptations can be lost because you'll adapt down rather than adapt up. And so sometimes we have this general term, sometimes we refer to this as the use it or lose it principle. So you either use it or you lose it. So how long does this take then? Well, it depends on the body systems we're talking about. It depends on the extent of existing fitness and so on. But some loose numbers about how long after training cessation. So training cessation, remember, is when you stop completely. So if you've been training for years and years and then you stop, depending on how your baseline, the speed at which or the length of time it takes for those adaptations to be lost will be slightly different. But for the average person, we would lose any cardiovascular or respiratory system or cardiorespiratory adaptations would be lost within the space of about 2 or 3 weeks. So after training cessation that's pushed you up to a level of overload and you've made some adaptations in the cardiorespiratory system, if you stop completely, within about 2 or 3 weeks, you would start to see that those adaptations would start to disappear. Okay, so they wouldn't necessarily immediately drop back to baseline level, but after 2 or 3 weeks, if you got yourself into a state of sort of what for you would be sort of your peak fitness, and then you stopped, you'd sort of hang around at that point really for a couple of weeks, maybe 3 weeks, and then you would start to see that level of fitness start to disappear. Okay, so this is particularly cardiorespiratory fitness. 2 or 3 weeks after doing nothing, then those adaptations that you'd previously gained will start to disappear or start to be lost. Slightly different for the muscular system. You get a little bit longer, a little bit more of a grace period, I suppose. So once you stop training your muscular system, it kind of stays roughly where it is for about 4 weeks before then it starts to lose those adaptations. So again, we're talking about training cessation, literally doing nothing with your muscles for 4 weeks. After about 4 weeks, then you'll start to see some significant loss of adaptation. Okay, so they'll start to atrophy or what have you. So 2 or 3 weeks for the cardiorespiratory systems, 4 weeks for the muscular systems, and that's why it's something to be remembered in terms of how often you plan sessions in a training program. You need to try and remember not to space them too far apart. If you space them too far apart, then you're at risk of losing some of these adaptations. And that whole concept is the concept of reversibility. Reversibility. So the next principle is the rest and recovery principle. Rest and recovery. So recovery, I don't mean rest and recovery in the sense that you have spaces of time within a workout, for example, where you're not working as hard as you might be. Those would be work rest intervals. What I mean by rest and recovery is the gaps between sessions, the time that you take between one session and the next session starting, how long do you give yourself and so on. And now rest and recovery is really important because we can avoid overtraining through appropriate recovery between sessions. And overtraining can be a significant problem. It can lead to all sorts of issues in terms of chronic tiredness and chronic fatigue and so on. So we really do want to avoid overtraining. We can damage our joints, our ligaments, our muscles, our tendons. We can create real damage through overtraining. So it's so important to have sufficient rest and recovery time between sessions. Now the session itself is often referred to as a catabolic phase. So a couple of technical terms here: catabolic and anabolic. The catabolic phase is the phase of training where the body systems are being broken down due to training. They're being stressed as a result of the training. That's the catabolic phase. The anabolic phase is when the body starts to rebuild and recover and restore those things that have been broken down, and it does so by responding and therefore creating the adaptations. So adaptations actually occur during the anabolic phase, but only based on the overload that was done during the catabolic phase. So the catabolic is the breakdown phase, the actual exercise itself, and the anabolic phase is the rest and recovery phase. And it's important, therefore, for effective training to balance the anabolic and catabolic phases for effective training. Because if your catabolic phase is mega intense and then your anabolic phase is not long enough to recover, then you're putting yourself at risk of overtraining. So let's do some examples. So the first example would be, let's say, as I've just said, your catabolic phase in red here with a large icon represents lots and lots of super hard work, whether it's high intensity or high volume or long distance running or whatever it might be. It will be different depending on your sport and your training program. But if you're doing loads and loads and loads of training in the catabolic phase, that is the catabolic phase, and then alongside it you're getting very little rest and very little recovery. Maybe you're training twice a day, for example. Maybe you're not giving yourself enough rest and recovery time. Maybe you train 7 days a week, something like that. If your anabolic phase is too small, is insufficient in comparison to the catabolic phase, you are going to end up experiencing what's called overtraining. So that's represented here with the icons, with the large icon for the catabolic phase and the small icon for the anabolic phase. What you really need to do is you need to make sure that you're balancing these things out. So whatever the catabolic phase is, if it's very intense, you need to give yourself sufficient amount of rest and recovery for your body to make the adaptations that the catabolic phase is provoking. So as the catabolic phase provokes through exercise, through overload, which hopefully should be progressive overload, you should give your body enough time to rest and recover and recuperate so that it can actually make those adaptations before you jump into your next session and create more muscle damage or whatever it might be. So that's how we find balance, and that will be slightly different depending on the intensity of the catabolic phase, of course. So the more intense the catabolic phase, the more rest and recovery is required. The less intense the catabolic phase, the less anabolic phase is required. So we need to get them balanced. And one of the ways that we can work this out is really to listen to your own body. If you're in pain after a workout, you probably need to consider giving yourself a decent bit of recovery time. The opposite is true though. So we can do overtraining by having too great a catabolic phase and too little of an anabolic phase. But if we go the opposite way and our catabolic phase, the training that we're doing is insufficiently hard work, we're not producing, we're not under a sufficient overload or under sufficient training stress, and we give ourselves loads and loads of recovery between sessions, actually we're in the position where we've got insufficient overload. And so we're now looking at the potential problem of what we've just talked about, the concept of reversibility. We might actually end up going backwards in our training because we've not planned sufficient amount of overload or sufficient catabolic phase, and we're giving ourselves too large an anabolic phase, if you like. Okay, too long to rest and recover and recuperate. Variation is the next principle. So we're nearly there with these. Variation is the next principle. Nice and simple. If you're planning a program, a fitness program, it's important to remember if you're doing the same thing over and over again, you're going to get bored. So variation is important because boredom is in fact a key factor that affects exercise adherence. People often give up on exercise because it's boring. So when planning a training program, it's important to add variety. And that variety can be different activities. You can still be stressing and working the same body systems from the specificity principle, okay, but you can be doing it in different ways. So change up the activities, change the machines that you use or whatever it might be. Change the locations that you work in. Use a different gym, run on a different track. Change your jogging route, whatever it might be. So different activities, different locations, work with different training partners, maybe put in some little mini competitions during your training just to keep things fun and exciting. And what's really important, as if you're a coach or a PT, have this discussion with the client. Discuss preferences in terms of exercise with your client. Get things varied. Don't always focus in on the same old week after week. Your client's going to start to get bored. So have a bit of variation, have a bit of variety in your exercise program, in your exercise plan. The next concept is the concept of individual needs, and this is fairly obvious, isn't it? Basically, you should have some consideration for the unique needs of each individual. And each individual, like we've just said, they'll get bored at different things or what have you, and they have different levels of overload are appropriate for different age groups and so on. So there's a whole bunch of things that would class as individual needs that you'll need to take into account other than just simply their current fitness level. Okay, so their fitness level, obviously that's a very important thing to consider, where they're currently at in terms of their fitness and progress from that point. But there are other things to consider as well, and these would include, among other things, their age. So their age will affect how quickly they can progress through a training program. If they're particularly up in years, they would need to have that progressive overload be a little bit more stepped, a little bit more progressive, a little bit more gradual, for example. They can still overload, but they might just need it to be slightly more gradual. Sex, so male, female, that will also impact the unique requirements, the unique needs. So for example, we know that female soccer players, female footballers are susceptible to ACL injuries. And so there are things that you can add into your training or into the programming that will assist with strengthening muscles to ensure that the angle of the hips is slightly stronger and so on. Okay, so these are some of the, I'm not going to get into that in this video, but there are some issues around sex that would determine individual needs for a particular program. Disability as well. Are there any accessibility issues and all that sort of, all that's got to be considered. Are there certain types of equipment that can and can't be used? Are there certain types of equipment that are preferable and less preferable for people with different kinds of disabilities? That's always important to consider. And obviously any existing or pre-existing or prior injuries also need to be taken into account. You don't want to be stressing someone's weak spots, essentially. If they've got a weak spot from previous injury, you don't want to exacerbate that injury. So these are things that, as far as individual needs are concerned, other than just their existing fitness level, that you need to consider and take into account. And then finally, there's the concept of adaptation. And really, adaptation is the heart of everything that we've been thinking and talking about in this video. Adaptation is the whole point of your training program. So an adaptation essentially is the name given to changes which occur in response to training. And it occurs, as we've just been thinking, it occurs during the recovery or the anabolic phase. The adaptations occur during the anabolic phase. So that gives you an indication now of why the anabolic phase is so important. It's not to be thought of as the catabolic phase is my training and the anabolic phase is not training. Actually, both of those things are important for training gains, for training adaptations. You've got to get them both right. Now, early on in terms of adaptations, when you start a new training program, the first adaptations you will experience are mostly neuromuscular adaptations. That is one of the reasons why people get frustrated when they, for example, start going to the gym and they think they're going to lose weight really quickly or they're going to bulk up really quickly. It very rarely happens initially, because early adaptation is almost always neuromuscular. That is, the brain and the body start to link together a bit more effectively. The nervous system pathways, the movement patterns, the ability for the muscles to recruit the fibers that are already there, all of that gets better first. So often you'll see in the first 6 to 8 weeks of a training program, people don't notice any size gains, for example, in their muscle. Because actually what's happening is the brain and the body and the connections between the two, or the brain and the muscle, I should say, and the connection between the two is getting more efficient. And only once the body has learnt to maximize what's already there, only then will it begin to adapt and either bulk up or slim down or whatever it is that you're trying to achieve, or improve the movement patterns. So the early adaptations is mostly to do with the link between the brain and the muscle, hence neuromuscular. And if you get through that phase and you continue to exercise in an appropriate way with an appropriate level of overload, after this what you'll find is that if it's high intensity training, so you're doing HIIT training or whatever it might be, or fartlek training, there's different kinds of high intensity training, typically you will see adaptations sooner in high intensity training than you would do in lower intensity endurance training. Not by much, but by a little bit. So early adaptations, the neuromuscular stuff. Then once the body and the brain, or body and the muscle, is nicely linked together, then the changes, the adaptations that occur with high intensity training, you'll see those first. And if you're doing lower intensity endurance stuff, you'll see adaptations later. Ultimately, eventually, you'll see adaptations that are based around the training that you're doing and the level of overload. Of course, you'll get there eventually, whichever type of training. It's just you'll typically see results from high intensity training a little bit before you see results from the lower intensity endurance stuff. So thanks for sticking with it. That's been a fairly lengthy video this time, but I appreciate there's lots of stuff to cover in terms of principles of training. If you've got any further questions, stuff that I didn't address that you'd like me to answer, please ask those questions in the comments and I'll get back to you. Other than that, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification icon to get notified every time I upload. Other than that, take care for now. See you next time.